The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, last week at this time, we were talking about a major breakthrough in the Sri Lankan debt relief standoff where China came through with a revised offer from the China Exim Bank to really unblock the impasse that they've been at for months in terms of Sri Lanka's debt relief process in freeing up money from the IMF. Now, we thought at that time that there would be some follow-up possibly in Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. We have not heard anything, but it has been an extremely eventful week since that discussion we had about debt relief. And we thought that was big news, but then we found out last Friday that the Chinese had brokered a breakthrough diplomatic deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That carried the news cycle for the weekend. And then early in this week, the news came out of San Diego, California, where Australia, the UK, and the United States announced a $400 billion submarine deal that's going to bring nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. That then dominated the news cycle in the midweek. And what's so interesting throughout all these big stories that we've had over the past week, Cobus, is that Africa seems to be fading a little bit in terms of the priority for the Chinese. Again, this is just in the past couple of weeks, but we can really say this over the course of the year that there really hasn't been the kind of events that we've typically seen from the Chinese in Africa in recent years. Meantime, and this is very important, Secretary of the United States, Antony Blinken, is in Africa this week. He is in Ethiopia and Niger. There was an announcement also that Vice President Kamala Harris will be going to Africa soon. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was just there. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield was also there. And even Joe Biden is expected to go sometime this year. And it really feels like the momentum in many respects has shifted to the United States. And the United States has really changed its tune on Africa in terms of talking about China. In the past, when a U.S. Secretary of State traveled to Africa, and this is going all the way back to the beginning of our show back in 2010. So this is not even a new phenomenon. But whenever a U.S. Secretary of State travels to Africa, it was always China, 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 China. Remember all those conversations, even with Hillary Clinton, with Mike Pompeo, and even the early part of the Blinken tenure in office, the press was always framing it about China. I looked high and low this week, Cobus, while we were putting together some of our newsletter for our subscribers for those stories about China regarding Blinken. Nothing. There was one from the AP buried in the fourth or fifth paragraph. That's it. So it does feel like we're in a different moment, Cobus, in terms of the relationship that the United States, that China are all having with Africa.
Yes, it certainly feels for the moment that things seem to be shifting. One might not want to assume that it's a new normal, simply because obviously on the US side, US interest in Africa kind of waxes and wanes. It's very encouraging that US officials are traveling to the continent so much and foregrounding the continent. But, obviously, fashions change in Washington, and sometimes, kind of new priorities come up. So we'll see how that goes. And then I think obviously on the Chinese side, we had the two sessions, we had these kind of very big diplomatic breakthroughs. So in the last 2 weeks or so, there hasn't particularly, I think, been that much space for speaking with Africa and about Africa, and I think everyone is kind of waiting to see, what will the next kind of shoe to drop in relation to the debt, particularly in relation to Zambia and Ethiopia. But outside of the debt question, I think, what we also need to look at is whether Africa-China relations are starting to normalize again, whether there's a kind of a post-COVID kind of swing back going to happen. And if it does happen, I assume it will happen over the space of months and years rather than weeks. But, it'll be very interesting to see whether there is a kind of a swing back, or whether what we're dealing with is a permanently kind of smaller relationship.
Yeah, I think it's really important, the point that you're making, not to read too much into the current moment because, again, things do change. Politics do change. We're in a very volatile period of history. But we thought it would be good today to get a perspective from Beijing about the mood that, and it's hard to really pick up. Beijing's a big city, but at least the mood from one or two corners of the cities. And for that, we're thrilled to have back on the show for the first time in 5 years. My goodness, that's been a long time. Kai Xue, who is a Belt and Road Initiative lawyer who's based in Beijing and advises clients on infrastructure financing deals in Africa. He's been doing this for a very long time. He's also done a lot of work in the African mining sector and is a regular commentator on China-Global South relations, including commentaries in many major publications about China-Africa relations. Kai Xue, it's great to speak with you again, and thank you for staying up so late for us.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Cobus. It's wonderful to be back.
It's great to have you, and it's great to be able to get your perspective because I really enjoy some of the comments that you make on LinkedIn and elsewhere. Let me put the same question to you that I put to Cobus in terms of where you think we are in this moment, given everything that's going on. The 2 sessions wrapping up in Beijing, so that was a huge domestic political event. We also have the AUKUS of, fiasco and debate that's been going on in terms of how China's responding to the new submarine deal in Australia, obviously tensions with the United States. Where, in your view, does Africa fit into the Chinese worldview?
I think because it's so busy now, and worst of all, not only is the world affairs so busy, there's the mounting tensions in the Western Pacific and, of course, surrounding China, so that overwhelms attention. And, of course, that does mean that Africa becomes a lower priority. It's just simply not thought about as much.
So, extrapolating from that, you work a lot on the Belt and Road. So I was wondering, from your perspective, where is the Belt and Road Initiative now? Recently, a few months ago, when the Global Development Initiative was announced, some analysts in the West were saying, the Belt and Road is being replaced by the Global Development Initiative. Since then, we've seen Belt and Road being name-checked, again, in speeches. There was indications that I think Foreign Minister Chingan said that there might be a Belt and Road summit happening later this year in Beijing. So I was wondering, from your perspective, how should we look at the Belt and Road at the moment?
Well, certainly you're right to point out that it has changed because there's not as much activity as before, and this has been going on for several years. And from my perspective, certainly, there's been a lot less work in terms of new loans being advanced. And so I'm a lot less busy. And yes, you might see me quite a bit more on LinkedIn, probably because I just have more time. But the thing is, it's not gone. So much has been invested in this thing, and it's still a good brand name, despite all the damage it has been taken from, relentless negative press from the prestige Western media for at least, the last 5 years since, I would say, 2018, when the New York Times came up with that story, how China got Sri Lanka to cough up a port. But setting that, the negative attention aside, I think there's just this intrinsic appeal across the world to see cross-border connectivity. And just in the recent year, actually it was in December 2021, I would say was the greatest triumph of the Belt and Road so far, which was that one segment of railway was built between Vientiane and Kunming. Kunming is the southwest China city, and Vientiane is the capital of Laos. So it was a fairly short segment of railway, but when it was opened, it created a continuous railway line all the way from Singapore to Portugal. So the entire Eurasian landmass is now connected by a railway. And this was not highlighted in the international media, but I saw when it was pointed out, it just excited a lot of people. So this is just one example of what the Belt and Road can offer. And I think there's a lot of potential momentum left, and it will keep on going.
It's interesting that you bring up the Laos-China Railway because that has been a success by a lot of measures. I mean, again, the debt sustainability questions still remain, but in terms of the volume of people and cargo going across the border, it's quite considerable. And it's interesting for those of us who follow China-Africa relations to compare in the short time that the Laos-China Railway has been up, and the volumes there compared to the standard gauge railway in Kenya and the volumes there, which they've been incrementally going up, but nowhere near as fast as what we're seeing in Southeast Asia. And it's interesting also that you bring up the question of Southeast Asia, because there was news this week as well that they're going to start working on the Myanmar-China rail link. The Thai and Chinese governments have been talking about the high-speed railway there, and then also Indonesia has just finished a high-speed railway. So there's a lot of excitement and energy still in Southeast Asia about large-scale infrastructure financing. That doesn't exist in Africa anymore. Can you help us understand a little bit about the priorities that China is placing for some of its BRI financing? And I don't even know if it's BRI financing anymore, or if it's GDI, Global Development Initiative, or if it's just a loan, maybe nothing to do with BRI or GDI or any plan of any kind. It's just a loan. Help us understand the hierarchy right now in terms of where China's placing its priorities.
It's because there are just so many parts of the world and so much activity all across the world. It's hard myself to organize my thinking in terms of what could be called a priority. But I predict that, of course, it will be in the Western Pacific, that priority, and that would include Southeast Asia, because this is where the tensions have been rising, and not simply tensions, but just the realistic possibility that things might go kinetic. And that certainly dominates attention.
Expanding on that a little bit, like this fear that there might be actual, either accidental or open conflict in that region. How is that shaping project planning also for that region?
Well, I would say it's still one of those things that are on the back of people's minds. And when it's in the back of people's minds, then I don't necessarily think that it deters planning, it deters projects from being undertaken. So that's just at the project level. But then at that more strategic level, it certainly shapes thinking in terms of where the bulk of resources will go and won't go.
So, given the fact that the Western Pacific, Southeast Asia in particular, is the focus based on what you're saying, when you have a chance to talk with your contacts in various African countries, do you get the sense that they understand how China's priorities have shifted, and that what was true about the Chinese in Africa 5-10 years ago may not be true anymore today? And I say this only because I'm always surprised when I see in the Nigerian media, Kenyan media, and various other of the major media in Africa how they're still talking about trying to get China to finance big projects. And it makes me wonder if they are reading the room correctly, if they understand the shifts that have happened in terms of China's priorities and the fact that it isn't funding anywhere near what it used to fund. And it has new priorities in its funding. It's not that Chinese funding has stopped altogether. It's just become smaller. It's a lot lighter. There's a focus on ROI. So there's new priorities in how the Chinese are funding projects in Africa. But at the same time, as you pointed out, they also have new geopolitical realities that they have to confront with as well, namely in the Western Pacific. So when you talk to people in Africa, what are those conversations like?
That is actually an interesting question, because and I hadn't thought about this, but your observation is exactly right in that I do not see that in the African discourse it's been shaped by any of the events in the Western Pacific. These are just different silos, but of course they are linked. And so even though it is predictable that the attention is shifting and will shift further and stay that way, nonetheless, this has not hit home in Africa. And part of that, I believe, actually not just part of it, but maybe most of it, is probably because it's Western media narratives that dominate the discourse everywhere. And as long as the Western media is highly interested in talking about China-Africa and competing, and Western governments, the US and EU, are responsive to that, and there is a lot of diplomatic engagement, and at the very least, at the G7, there are huge announcements of infrastructure partnerships, then that is the narrative that will carry, and it's what people will be thinking about a lot.
Cobus, let me give you a chance to respond to that and get your take on whether your conversations are similar to what Kai Xue is talking about.
To a certain extent, yes. I think I've heard some kind of African stakeholders acknowledge that there are shifts in Chinese funding, certainly. But I agree with Kai Xue that they don't tend to draw a direct kind of causal link between that and China's priorities in, say, Southeast Asia. I think the thinking tends to be quite kind of polarized. And I think there's a kind of an assumption that China's interest in Africa is both semi-permanent and very limited. There is this assumption, I think, still in Africa that the relationship is primarily about extractives. And of course, extractives is an important part of the relationship, but it's not the sole part of the relationship. And certainly at the moment, kind of as China is moving into green energy and, connectivity and so on, it's an important part of the relationship. It's only a part of the relationship. And I think there's less kind of awareness of that and how it fits into global priorities. Kai Xue, if we flip the question, when you speak with your colleagues and with your contacts in Beijing and in China more broadly, like, how do they talk about Africa now? There was always this kind of optimism about the potential for African development, and I was wondering whether some of the debt issues, which a lot of it is not actually of Africa's making, whether that has been a dampener, and then also just how Africa features in their conversations now.
Well, I mean, even at the height of lending, it was always very low key in terms of people thinking about China-Africa relations, even among those people who work in investment and financing that crosses borders. So it's actually hard to compare because there was already that low base. I tend to think that maybe the best answer is that there is no change.
So there is no change in terms of a continuing, for those people who are optimistic about working in Africa are still optimistic about working in Africa?
Well, if I were just to talk about the people in the financing and investment communities, I don't think there was a lack of attention, and there still is. And I would say that would describe what is going on now too. So there's just no change in the enthusiasm or level of attention.
So that's both good and bad news in one sense. It's good news because that if there's no change, the Chinese government, at least in the policy side of things, and they were rather enthusiastic 5-6 years ago. So if that's it, but at the same time, Africa was still a lower priority relative to other parts of the world. So in that sense, that's not good news. So it's a little bit of mix, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
It's also important to note that 6 years ago, there was a lot more lending everywhere else. So the fact that there was a lot of lending 6 years ago to African countries should not reflect a higher intensity of interest because that just reflected global trends.
So when we look at the Belt and Road now, coming up on the 10th anniversary this year, you're somebody who's followed it almost from the inception, if not from the beginning. When we look at it where it is today, and we look back at the mistakes that were made. So I think that Kenya was a mistake. Hamandota was a mistake. These were projects that probably shouldn't have been funded for various different reasons. That being said, it does seem like there's been a lot of course correction by the Chinese government to avoid those mistakes again. So again, that's why we're not going to see $6 billion railroads in Africa anymore. The very idea of financing a 100-year project on a 20-year loan doesn't make sense financially to do anywhere in the world. And I think the Chinese have finally woken up to that. But so when we look back on 10 years of the Belt and Road in Africa and elsewhere, what are your impressions? What do you think back?
Oh, yeah. I think the first idea that springs to mind is that there were serious mistakes that were made in terms of the projects that were lent to, and also just the overall level of volume of loans. There was too much of it. And so after these mistakes, and the full extent of the lesson still hasn't yet been felt, there is going to be some self-reflection and retreat and adjustment after that.
Specifically in relation to lending, do you foresee that all of the kind of processes that China is going through now in relation to debt restructuring, is that gonna some of the researchers that we spoke with have made the point that one of the issues, the kind of under-examined issues in all of the complexities of Chinese lending is the role of individual officials within these policy banks and the kind of career impact something like writing off a loan would have, for individuals and departments. So I was wondering how you think the officials involved, in the kind of large-scale lending that we saw during the 2010s, how are those officials going to be affected by some of the debt restructuring that's happening now? And how do you think the institutions themselves might pivot?
At the individual employee level or manager level, I've rarely seen any kind of a discipline, maybe you can call it. So as institutions, though, of course, they will reflect the changes in policy that come from after a big penalty has been paid for all those mistakes, and there's going to be a course change, then those institutions will change with it. In terms of career impact for bureaucrats, I'm not seeing that because, these are state-owned companies. They are going to be certainly relative to Western banks and, let's say, their Wall Street peers, they're going to be much more easygoing. And it's not, an up or out system.
Interesting, because when we think of the lending issues over the past few months, the topic that everybody's talking about is this question of the face-off between China, the Chinese policy banks, and what's called the MDBs, the Multilateral Development Banks, the IMF and the World Bank. And the Chinese have been insisting in their public statements and in their actions that they want other creditors to equally share in the write-downs and the losses. Specifically, they want commitments from commercial creditors, which I think everybody agrees on. The problem is with these MDBs, and that the MDBs are not structured to take losses or write-offs or haircuts, is what they say, in the back end of these deals. What they say is they get the money cheap up front, and that is the loss, and then they provide it to developing countries in Africa and elsewhere. In many cases of smaller African countries, the World Bank and the IMF are the only sources of outside capital. And yet the Chinese are now trying to force this change that the MDBs take write-downs. No one on the outside, and people we speak with, can figure out what is the strategy here. Do you have any thoughts or, again, just ideas? And I know you're not sitting inside the Chinese government with the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank in these policy meetings to figure out what's going on. But when people ask, what are they trying to do? What's going on? What would you say? What's your best guess as to what the game plan is here?
Well, I think there can be a compelling narrative that the World Bank should also take the same haircut. Right? I don't buy into their excuses, which is that their loans are that cheap or that they're the only source of financing. There's plenty of different options. So I think overall they are, Well,
plenty of different options for who, by the way? Because Togo doesn't have a lot of options.
Oh, I'm sure the government can borrow and find investors. It's not the World Bank alone. It's nowhere near sufficient compared to the amount of investment they need, but there are options.
I have a feeling that people would disagree with that, because one of the biggest complaints that we hear is that African governments struggle to find capital to fund infrastructure. And the options are, yes, there are other options. They're just all beyond affordable. So you can go to the private bond markets to borrow money at 8% a year, but you can't afford to pay it back. So it's an option, but it's really not an option.
I think we can both agree that it's really insufficient. A lot of the options are very expensive, but we can also say that the World Bank doesn't lend all that much, and relative to moderately good options that Togo or any other host government might have, the World Bank, doesn't tower over everything else. So this gets into what I think could be a good strategy, which is the fact that all these excuses made by the World Bank about why they shouldn't participate are generally weak. And I think if China and the policy banks were smart about this, I think we can actually rally a lot of people and persuade them that the World Bank indeed should participate. So I really do feel that there might be some odds of success here, which, judging by the skeptical tone that you guys have, I guess you would disagree with that.
It's not the skeptical tone. It's the skepticism that I have is that they have other options. And one of the things we keep hearing, and Cobus, you've been saying this for a very long time, is that they don't have many options. Oftentimes it's been China or nothing, or in many cases it's the World Bank or nothing. And that's been part of the problem, simply because private investors They're not interested in these smaller, poorer countries and the poorest countries in Africa. And the question is that what we hear, and again, I don't know what's what, I'm not an insider, I don't have any particular expertise in this, but that the system, the Bretton Woods system, was not set up this way. And so the reforms that China's trying to implement do challenge some very basic tenets of it. That being said, as Hannah Ryder at Development Reimagined has pointed out, they have taken write-offs in the past during the highly indebted poor country reforms, I think 10, 15 years ago. So there is precedent for the Bretton Woods organizations to take haircuts. They just don't want to do it now, and they say they're not set up for it. And the IMF and the World Bank have ruled it out and said, we're not going to do it. And what's happening, though, is that Zambia is the collateral damage. And I guess I'm surprised that the Zambian government hasn't said, China, figure this out. We got to get through this now, but I got to get my debt restructuring done. So you guys can take this fight offline, but clear the way for us to get our debt restructuring. And it seems like as the Chinese are dragging this fight out, important to the Chinese as it may be, that countries in Africa are suffering. And I can't figure out what the game plan is of the Chinese to allow a country like Zambia to suffer so much.
Well, why do you pin it completely on China?
Well, because right now, that's what basically every internal stakeholder says is the problem, is this question, this standoff over the question of the write-downs on the World Bank seems to be the holdup, and that China has not, as we saw in Sri Lanka, has not wanted to go along with the other bilaterals in terms of restructuring the debt. That's per the IMF requirements, that there is alignment among bilateral creditors. So China is the holdout here. And I'm not necessarily singling out China for any political reason. It's just, and they've even said that they're the holdout. They want a change. This is what the Exim banks and even the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs are saying. They want this change to happen before they can move forward with debt relief. So this is not even a secret that the Chinese are the holdout.
Well, look at it this way. There are so many borrowers out there, and there could be so many crises in the future that just imagine if there are bad terms from this workout, what the cumulative consequences could be. I think let's just imagine, right, the next 20 years of Chinese policy bank lending for critical infrastructure in Africa, right? What if so much of the lending in the last 20 years is not repaid? Then how much lending is there going to be in the next 20 years? So we also have to think about the future too. So perhaps we should get some leeway, for just holding out a bit. And perhaps also everyone else can get on board with this idea that the World Bank needs to participate in this haircut because its excuses are kind of lame.
In terms of where does China-Africa relations go from here, where we are at 2023, as we started our conversation, this is a especially busy period in world affairs. If President or Prime Minister from African country X, Y, or Z came to you and said, Kai Xue, help us better understand how we should talk to Chinese leaders. Xi Jinping is going to give me a phone call next week, or the China Exim Bank is coming to town, or I'm meeting with the ambassador. Help me understand what I should say in order to better position my country to leverage the relationship with China. What would you tell them?
I would tell them, maybe the best thing now is because there is so much new competition from the US and EU, you should see that one of the best goals that China can serve for your country is to draw in new competition and new resources. So what I mean by that is if loans are repaid, then there will still be additional lending over the next years from Chinese policy banks, and that will draw in and pressure the US and EU to also make investments and lending, which right now I am not seeing in the Biden proposed budget for fiscal year 2024. You just see at the G7 some big figures and a press release. So the best advice I can give is keep the competition going. And you can keep the competition going by making sure that China isn't pushed out.
In related terms, I was wondering how we're seeing all of this geopolitical pressure between the United States and China. And we're seeing a lot of that pressure landing in unpredictable ways on development issues, for example. We've seen several, for example, kind of internet, kind of data network expansion projects coming under geopolitical pressure, for example. So I was wondering how you foresee the ongoing geopolitical pressure kind of influencing the Belt and Road, and how is, kind of in a very geopolitical 2020s, how will the Belt and Road be different from how it started off in a less geopolitical 2010s?
The chief problem now with geopolitics dominating the Belt and Road is the narratives. And what I mean by that is just the Western media narratives and also the US government-generated narratives. For example, just in the last month, I saw in the editorial board of the Washington Post refer to some Chinese lending as predatory. And that kind of narrative that creates the suspicion in the minds of all the possible countries that could borrow from Chinese policy banks. And that suspicion in itself could stop the transaction from occurring. And so the principal problem that exists now compared to last year is that based purely on propaganda, and when I use that term propaganda, what I'm referring to is something like legislation right now that's going through the U.S. Congress called the Countering PRC Malign Influence Fund. And for just a little bit of funding in propaganda, I believe it's possible for Western governments to block the Belt and Road from succeeding or expanding.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about it, because when you talk to a lot of Americans, they will put the Chinese propaganda and Chinese narrative capabilities as the 10-foot tall monster that are seemingly insurmountable. In fact, you heard at these hearings that you've referenced in Washington last week, both in the Senate and in the House, talking about the nefarious messaging and tactic of the CCP and whatnot. And yet, at the same time, when we hear from Chinese stakeholders, the Western media narratives become equally potent in their impression. So both sides seem to have this vision of the other as being more effective in media propaganda and messaging. I just find that an interesting observation. I would be interested to hear your take on that.
I think that sounds preposterous to any objective observer, because who controls global narratives? And that is the Western media. As we saw, just last month with the lab leak hypothesis, the Western media can decide to suppress it for a while, and then in 1 week, they can turn on the switch and splash it on the front page. So it's not just this power, but it's this precision of control that is so readily apparent. And I don't know how nefarious Chinese propaganda is, but even if it were, it would just be completely ineffective and powerless compared to that absolute domination of the Western media.
Well, it's very interesting. Well, Kai Xue, thank you so much for taking the time to share your broad breadth of views on so many different topics. Again, we pinged you on so many different areas, and it's really just a treat for us to be able to do that and to get your insights. Kai Xue is a Belt and Road Initiative attorney based in Beijing who advises clients on infrastructure financing deals in Africa. He's very active on LinkedIn, and I will put a link to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes, and he comments quite a bit in the discussions that I have on LinkedIn as well. And so look for Kai Xue there. Kai Xue, thank you so much for joining us and staying up late. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Cobus, I hope there are people in African policymaking and think tank circles who were able to listen to what Kai Xue had to say. And in many ways, his message is quite sobering, that the world has changed. And we've said this on a number of occasions, that African stakeholders, again, in academia, think tanks, policymaking, up and down the public policy universe, need to change their thinking on China. And I don't get the impression that they have fast enough. And just the events of the past couple of weeks, with the two sessions, AUKUS, the Western Pacific standoff and challenges, Sri Lanka and the debt, the world is moving very, very fast. And I really do hope I really, really hope that the governments in Nairobi and Abuja and Lusaka and Pretoria can figure out ways to better engage the Chinese in this new environment.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important, I think, for African governments and global South governments as a whole to become a lot more innovative, I think, in how they deal with China. They have to obviously take cognizance of changing priorities within China, particularly also the focus towards more green transition projects, more connectivity projects, all of the kind of small is beautiful kind of project design that's in vogue in Beijing at the moment. So, those like taking note of those changes and kind of swinging project planning around what is possible, and also taking, as Kai Xue pointed out, the kind of making the most of the kind of heightened competition from Europe and the US, and kind of keeping the Chinese on board while kind of maximizing this new energy from the West. All of those things are really important, but I think they're going to have to be even more innovative than that, particularly in relation to connecting development with climate. There are interesting kind of tools being developed and initiatives being discussed by, for example, the president of the Bahamas. And, all of this discussion about, for example, debt for climate swaps, like these kinds of like really innovative tools, like those are going to be crucial. And I think it's really important for global South countries and African countries particularly to play a kind of a leadership role in developing those, getting them road ready, kind of getting them down to the size of actual investable projects. I think that's going to be key.
Well, just to pick up on that point here, is one of the areas where I think African leaders can be much more proactive is guiding and leading the conversation as to what they want from the US, Europe, Japan, and others in terms of how to best maximize the investment that they've made in African infrastructure built by the Chinese. So let's take the Entebbe Highway, for example, in Uganda. So the Ugandans, and the airport as well, the Ugandans forked out a huge amount of money for this new highway and this new airport in Entebbe to be built. Now, how do you best monetize it? How do you best leverage that? How do you best integrate it into your economy? And that's where, again, the US, Japan, and Europe have a lot of expertise. What we have a situation right now is the Chinese build infrastructure over there, and that's the Chinese stuff. And then the Americans and the Europeans and everybody else, they work on other things. And I think that's completely stupid, because what I think they need to do is integrate this infrastructure into their economy with services and management, or else we have a situation like what's happened in Addis Ababa with the light rail system. The light rail system has fallen on hard times because of lack of parts and disrepair. I don't blame the Chinese for that. That is entirely up to the governance of the administrators of that light rail system. The Chinese built it, but for some reason, there was this discussion that the Chinese are complicit in the failure of the light rail system, when in fact it was poor management of the light rail system that led to the lack of maintenance and parts and whatnot. And so in order to maximize the investment in the infrastructure, how do you incorporate it into the economy? How do you bring better management to it? And those are things that the US and Europe do very well. And Japan is too. I mean, no one manages infrastructure better than the Japanese, okay? But we still have this bifurcation here. The Chinese stuff is on one side, and we're going to do other stuff on the other side. And I think African policymakers can force those two together if they want. I think that's my view.
Well, kind of we've been calling for many years for African governments to kind of set up their own integrated development plans, kind of where all of these different external players, kind of fit into an African agenda. African governments haven't been very good with that so far, and this kind of like nitty-gritty work of doing the governance and doing the maintenance and making sure that the contracts include spare part allocations and making, like all of that kind of work. That kind of work hasn't generally been very effective in Africa. And, I live in a city that's rough, kind of falling apart at the seams for exactly some of those reasons. So Africa hasn't been very good at at putting a centralized development roadmap in place and then really following it, And so, here we are.
And I'm hoping that Americans and Europeans will not have the mindset that says this was a piece of Chinese-built infrastructure, therefore we're not going to work on it. and we're not going to be involved in it. And if it goes south, well, that's, you see, Chinese infrastructure sucks. Because the people who pay the price for that are the taxpayers in Africa and the governments. They suffer the most. And so I'm hoping that ideological blindness will not get in the way of what the ultimate objective here is, which is, again, what's best for constituents in various African countries. Just the same as it is in South America and also in Southeast Asia. That should be the mindset as well. I'm not convinced that our discourse today around China in the West will permit for that. And as we saw from the British Prime Minister this week, where he came out very strongly and said, basically, China is a systemic threat to the international order. It doesn't seem like that type of innovative thinking is going to be tolerated. So it's in many ways up to African stakeholders to assert that. And I worry a little bit that they are not doing that because, again, we haven't seen that type of assertion in the debt restructuring discourse. And it feels a little bit like they're waiting for others to do things rather than trying to take control of the narrative and pushing hard. Maybe I'm speaking from a point of view of privilege in the sense that I sit outside this process, and when you're in the middle of it, it's vastly more complicated and there's so many moving parts. But I look at a case like Zambia and I just go, why aren't they calling the Chinese out? Why aren't they calling out the international community? Why aren't they calling out the creditors? And maybe it's because they don't want to burn their bridges for the next round of financing in 20 years. I don't know, but it seems just inconceivable to me that we're just going to let Zambia dangle there. We're now going on almost 2 years in their debt restructuring process. And yet there's been no movement. We're stuck. And I don't understand how this works. I'll be honest with you.
I think, obviously this is why we keep having these conversations, that we keep bringing in these different stakeholders to explain these different aspects of this process. And I think it would be very good for us to circle back to African debt experts, to ask them, what is the political leverage between, or the difference in political leverage between calling people out in public and kind of speaking with them behind closed doors, right? Kind of those, obviously, those calculations are happening,
right.
Kind of at the moment. But at the same time, I think what is also very, very needed, I think, is just for Africa to kind of step into its position of moral intellectual leadership as a whole, like if, like a lot of the work that someone like Greta Thunberg does, Africa should be doing that work, right? And of course, it's like her colleague Vanessa Nakate is doing that work, and she is doing it from an African perspective. But what I mean is that the voice of how we go into the future with climate change, the voice of how do we finance, development, the voice of what is the future of our children going to look like, those voices should be African voices. Like Africa should be at the center of that conversation. They shouldn't be like sitting on the side of it, and there I feel like there's this weird Africa-shaped vacuum in the conversation at the moment. It's like Africa it's punching far below its weight.
Why is that then? I mean, what's the reason? So we all know that's happening, but what do you think the motivation or the reason is for that?
Well, I think, in the first place, I do agree with Kai Xue that we live in a kind of, in a media landscape that is disproportionately kind of shaped by Western discourse. I think that, from an African perspective, at least, that I think is clear. But I think what it also is that obviously there's many, there isn't one Africa. There's many, many stakeholders, and a lot of those stakeholders are governments. And particularly also, kind of politicians within governments who have their own priorities, and and as we know from not to sound too South African and too cynical, but the well-being of African populations is pretty low on many African politicians' list of priorities. So that's one issue. But I think at the moment there's aspects there that I don't understand. There's maybe a feeling of just being defeated and exhausted, like that is probably a very strong, kind of like aspect of the problem. But kind of like I do feel that they're particularly in a moment where social media itself is so powerful. I feel that there's really a space for people to step into, but I'm not 100% sure why they're not there yet.
And I don't understand why African governments are not calling out the United States more on these issues of climate. You brought up this question of being the moral voice of climate. And when the United States kind of rolls up into Africa and Southeast Asia and talks about just transitions and talks about green economy and we've just been hearing this endlessly now with these parade of U.S. officials who've been going to Africa. And yet, this week, the Biden administration said it's going to approve one of the largest oil projects in American history, the Willow Oil Project on the North Slope of Alaska. And this is a multi-billion-dollar ConocoPhillips deal that's going to produce up to 180,000 barrels a day of oil. I mean, again, we have a drinking game, apparently, with some of our listeners that every time I say cognitive dissonance in terms of, the great powers. So if you've got a beverage in hand, here we go. I mean, the cognitive dissonance between what the U.S. says on climate change and what it does is remarkable. And that goes to Kai Xue's point as well. All the big promises coming out of the G7 and the global gateway. I mean, when are we going to see it, right?
Yeah.
And we cannot bank on, well, this is going to come in 5-10 years, because should we have President Trump Part 2 or President DeSantis Part 1, you're never going to see that, because American politics is far too volatile today now to have any type of predictability as to what's going to happen in the future. So the Biden administration says they're going to do this, but a future Republican administration will never do it.
Yeah, I mean, one has to give, some African folks, kind of stakeholders their due. For example, Namibian President Hage Geingob was literally calling Western countries criminals, in relation to climate issues at COP27 last year. But, again, it's a fine line, right? Kind of because on the one hand, simply because of media coverage and because of power, these allegations don't stick, right? Kind of there's a Teflon layer, that makes most of them kind of fall away. And then when they, when the other option is then for whatever kind of very strident critic from the global south to immediately be turned into a kind of a boogeyman, which is another, which also happens quite frequently. So, it's not necessarily surprising this criticism doesn't stick, but the realities we're talking about aren't going away. And the issue is more for me is that there has to be made a space in this discussion of actual global south stakeholdership and priorities, rather than always it getting framed into what the global north can afford. What they can afford to pay, or what they're willing to pay, or what, kind of what different stakeholders in the global north are willing to give, or, sure, all of that stuff is important, but, kind of moving from the perspective of global south livelihoods themselves has to, more work is needed in pushing that perspective.
I just want to draw everybody's attention to the new campaign for the president of the World Bank, the nominee, who is making a tour right now. He's a U.S. nominee, former CEO of MasterCard, and he's making a tour of Africa, European capitals and whatnot to raise awareness for his campaign. And there is some discrepancy to the point, Cobus, you've been making in terms of these different agendas. And it was, again, we've mentioned this on a previous show, how it was the South African finance minister who pushed back on the U.S. and European demand that the World Bank focus more on climate issues. And your finance minister was very clear in saying, well, we appreciate that climate issues are important. What's important right now for Africa is the vacuum or the gap in infrastructure financing that the World Bank is uniquely positioned to benefit or to provide. And so we're going to see this. What are the priorities? Is it going to be something prescribed by the U.S. and Europe, as is often the case with the Bretton Woods institutions, or is it going to be something demanded from by global South countries like South Africa? And so let's watch to see how World Bank agendas kind of line up under the new presidency and this new administration. So that will be something to keep an eye on. So let's leave the conversation there. It was great to get Kai Xue on the show. We've had a couple of Chinese perspectives over the past few weeks, and I think that's fantastic, because without the Chinese voice in this discussion, we're missing so much. It's not easy to get Chinese voices, as we all know, but it's fantastic that people like Kai Xue, and we've had think tank and diplomats and other experts coming on recently, and so we're really happy to be able to bring you that. We'll continue to look for Chinese voices because, again, they're often missing in a lot of the news coverage, and so we just want to try and provide a more balanced perspective on all of that. So anyway, Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, if you want to follow everything that we're doing, sign up for our newsletter, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You can get a 30-day free trial. But these issues are the kinds of things that we deep dive every single day and drop off in your mailbox every morning, Monday to Friday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States. So we will be back again next week with another show. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.